Hi, my name is Benedict. In this video, I'm going to be running through some tips for helping you to be creative. So many people struggle with, oh well, I've got this loop and now I'm stuck. And so they save the loop off and then they start again and then they're stuck and stuck and stuck and stuck. And I see this a lot. I get sent things and I see what's gone wrong just by looking in their workspace. I'm not talking about anyone in particular, but I do see this over and over. And the reality is, if we work differently, we will get different results. That's self-evident. Firstly, we should attack the very flawed thinking. For most people, the idea is that creativity comes as a result of no limits. If I don't go to work, therefore I have more time to be creative. I will be more creative. If I'm not wearing pants, I will be freer to be more creative. If I don't have to follow any kind of rules or anything like that, then I will be more creative. Because people think that creativity is a result of no limits. But the reality is that limits, and in my parlance, brutal crushing limits, is what tends to deliver the most amazing creativity as people find ways to get around those limits. So this is a way of imposing some order on yourself, much as you might go, that's not right, but imposing order on yourself to allow yourself to become more creative, more productive. We'll be working under the motto of, which I borrowed from the Greenies, work locally, but think globally. This is a big factor because I see so many people are thinking locally, working locally, and thinking that that's ultimately going to build into some kind of global. But what are you building towards? Largely, they have no idea. They have a fantasy about what they want it to be. And remember my video on Dorville being a toxic religious cult, that one of the key stones of setting that up is having people live in fantasy. When we think globally, yes, we can think in fantasy, like I think a lot of Greenies think in fantasy, but globally, we're saying, what's the big picture? What are we trying to achieve here? And then we make actions locally, there's my hand, to actually say, does this match what we want as big picture? Okay, so if I nuke Belgium, is it going to make world peace? Sadly not, because it's probably going to upset some people. So we've got to say, well, what would be better suited to what our aim is? All of this I'm going to put under also the banner of preparing the ground. Most people don't prepare the ground for what they're doing. So it's a little like going out, throwing pineapples on the ground, and then wondering why in 2 years' time you don't have pineapples. You haven't prepared the ground. With pineapples, in theory, they're relatively easy to grow. You just hack the top off a pineapple, touch it to the ground, and in a fair amount of the time, it will actually grow a pineapple, provided you have good pineapple growing environment, which is lots of sun. But throwing pineapples at the ground will not automatically give you a forest of pineapples. Dull. Plus, you have to be super patient. You need lots of sun, and you need to have 2 years before you get your first pineapple. Oh, an awful lot more if your ground is less than perfect. So we need to prepare the ground. For me, the first bit of ground preparation that I do is actually in Reverb. Here is a piece. There is a reverb going on. If I take that away, it sounds very uninspired. I've got no sense of what I'm working towards. It's just these things put somewhere. As soon as I put a reverb in, reverbless, I now have a sense of space, the scene that I'm putting this in. I'm not going to go heavily through reverb because I have done that lots of times for myself and higher hertz. It helps tremendously when you've got the ability to audition your reverb. So, okay, this helps set the scene for the space in which this is happening. I'm thinking it might be a little bit gothy, therefore a little bit gothic-y, spooky, graveyard, mausoleums kind of stuff. You can say, oh, but how does that represent that? Well, you've just got to work it out in tone and feel and what have you. Again, I've made whole videos of that. So one of the first things that I do as soon as I realize I'm going somewhere is to say, okay, what have I got? Where do I think I'm going? What do I think the scene is for this? And in this case, as I've said, I think we've got elements of goth. Therefore, I put it into that space. Now, this is where a lot of people go, oh, but I don't know anything about Reverb, and then just put in the first preset that they can find. Let's have a quick look-see at my Reverb, and again, this is not about how to make Reverb, but you'll see that I've actually ended up piling up 3 devices here to make the one Reverb. I've had to do a bit of work to get the result that I'm looking for. It's a bit churned up, and that is how I now decide everything is going to go into this space. Everything's going to work with this space. I've now created the limit, which is this is the space. I'm not trying to say this is everything for everyone, everywhere, because that's a losing proposition. We need to define that. Who is going to be interested in this product? What is this about? Here are my parameters. And so defining my Reverb forces me to say, here is the scene. Try to avoid presets and focus on how do I create the feel I'm looking for. And if that means that you have to do some wacky things with strange ganged delays, wonky pitch shifters, and frequency shifters, and some good old-fashioned clipping, then that is exactly what you should do, and no less. If you go, but I don't know how to do that, then you've got 2 choices. One is to say, oh, I'm going to just work with a rough reverb, I'm going to hire a mix engineer and make sure that he understands what I'm doing. The other is to simply train yourself to, rather than going, well, I don't know, because I don't know equals death every time. Oh, look, there's a tortoise, I don't know what to do. Oh, well, I better lie down and die. That doesn't get you anywhere, is to say, well, okay, I'm going to do the best approximation of what I think I want by being bold. Well, there's a tortoise, what do I do? Run the other direction, or casually slide in the other direction, seeing it's a tortoise, jump over it. There are a million things that you could do to avoid said killer tortoise. The next one that's very related is naming. You will see my document is currently called document 2. That is not good naming. I haven't given it a name yet. I haven't thought about giving it a name yet, but it does need a name. And I will compose much better when I have a name. That's narrative. If I call it avoiding the killer tortoise, then I've got more of a feeling of what I'm working towards than I do if it's called document 2. If, however, I tried to be a smartass and just come up with a stupid name like avoiding the killer tortoise, when it's got nothing to do with what I'm doing, then that means that I've just fractured the ground in which I'm working. So start preparing your ground. And then you need to always have a tidy workspace. And I know a lot of people, again, feel like untidy is where creativity comes from, or think that the work that they're doing is tidy because it makes sense to them. But let me tell you, more often than not, it is not tidy. I will strongly recommend to, if you don't have 2 or 3 monitors, one for each of the dominant screens or scenes in your workspace, then use one screen at a time. So I believe that's this. So when I'm thinking mixing tasks, I have the mixing window open. When I'm thinking device tasks, sounds, instruments, synths, that sort of stuff, I have this window open. But when I'm composing, I only have this window open. Now with 3 screens, I can have one on each screen, and it allows me to move my focus backwards and forwards. But the danger of this approach is that you've now got all this splatter all over your screen. And I know a lot of people are going to be going, but it's exciting, it makes me feel creative. Because there's all this possibility. Oh, look, those little wheels can turn and I can feel. Nah, that's you playing with yourself. Put your trousers back on, put your hands up on the workbench, and focus on what matters. Remember, if we are to work locally, we need to think globally. This is global now. I'm focusing on what's important. When I'm working with synthesizers, yes, I can be focused here, but when I'm no longer with them, I need to be here. Having 3 screens with lots of stuff all the time makes you feel special, but that's your ego. That is not the job. That's not you doing great work. We'll also say it's really important to close, minimize. Look at this. Again, people will be like, oh, but this makes me feel so producery. I'm in control of all these knobs and buttons. I'm a veritable Captain Kirk. Nah, it's actually a toss. Again, put some underpants on, put your trousers on, put your hands up on the workbench. I do have this compressor working at the moment and the maximizer working at the moment simply because I've pulled the levels up and I want to make sure that they're controlled, but I've only done that because I'm making this. Otherwise, all of these things would be off, with the exception of the maximizer. But if I see there's action happening here, my my work needs to be dealt with. I have a whole other video on the fact that I turn my knob up, so I might be working at my composing and mixing might be running at -6 or -12 dB, and I add that 6 or 12 dB on my volume knob so that my speakers are roughly the same level as I would be for normal listening, which will happen to be the same level as when I get to mastering, because I will turn my volume knob down because I'll have gained that extra 6 or 12 dB or whatever here. So these are unnecessary, so I close them down. You see my reverb here. Now there's a whole lot of stuff, really hard to understand and focus on what's going on. These are extras to the reverb, so I will close them down. Over in my mixer, where my reverb comes back, rather than it being named the random name of the device, or its patch or whatever, I've just put reverb. Because you know what, that's a lot clearer and simpler to work out than SDO2. What's SDO2 got to do with anything? It's really the reverb that matters. So be really tidy, close everything that you can. This is not doing anything. I'm going to close it. I probably should have pulled this out before I even made the video. This is not doing anything, so close it. I don't need that open. I don't need that open. I don't need that open. I don't need that open, or that, or that. I can see that this is a track or instrument, and it's carefully named. The same with all of this stuff. I just close it down. Because having all these things open at once just creates a lot of clutter. See how much more focused we are now. If I want to do something with the string, then I can open it, work on it, close it. Now I've got a much more focused workspace. Close things down. When we're in our workspace here, then we also need to minimize. I will work very much on a consistent order. Remember, we closed, so it's easier to see what's going on. Now I've got a guitar, a string, a bass, and some drums, and that's pretty upside down. I'm going to say, let's have a very consistent order. I'm going to put my drums first. I'm going to put my bass second, because they're now my rhythm section. Guitar and then string. Okay, fair enough, that makes sense. Now in lots of DAWs, that automatically scrolls through to what's happening here, but for some reason they broke that. So I will then go through and organize drums, bass, guitar, string. But even better, in Reason, I could have multiple racks. So I'm going to drag these over, drums and bass, melodic instruments. Much tidier. I will even go into putting this into a bus. So on the mixer, when I look at the mixer, they will make a lot more sense. Colors here. I always color my rhythm buses yellow, because in Reason the color yellow is virtually impossible to work with. My drums I always color wheat. My bass I always color peach. You can choose whatever you want, but they're the colors that I have. Guitars I tend to color green, and strings and synths I tend to color blue. Now that makes it so much easier that now I can actually see my organization. I'm going, oh, well, I don't need to do that because I know what's going on. It's like, yeah, but imposing this order says that I am thinking globally, I'm working locally, and I'm having a very consistent order. So now the order between my different screens is completely the same. So that makes it so much easier to work. The other thing that I see that people are not doing is in their sequencer arrangement, they've got tons and tons of little blocks, like this really helps. Oh, but they're so busy, man. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is close down automation that I don't need to see. I don't need to see it because I only need to see it when I'm working on it. When I'm working on it, I'll go, okay, that's the guitar sound I want to automate. I'll open the automation for it. I'll work on it. Expanded, blah, 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 finished, gone, bye-bye, closed. So now I can focus on things. But look, we've got all these little blocks and they're all the same. They're all 2 bars long. Often I see 1 bar blocks or even less. And there's just this infinity of tiny, 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 tiny blocks. And it's impossible to get any sense of what's going on. And often that is overcome by trying to put in markers and things like that. More clutter. Now, if we listen to this, okay, each of those is a phrase, so it makes sense for them to be that long. Okay, now we've clearly changed. So I can take each of these, and again, you've got to work out how to do it in your DAW, but I can join them. These are phrases within a bigger phrase or section. Okay, so again, we can say, I'm working on this. So that's an 8-bar loop, 2468, 2468. So I can turn all of these into 8-bar sections. And by doing this, it is significantly easier to say what belongs where, because this little block here is not this little block here, it's part of this phrase or section. And if we're looking at score, dots on a page, we actually commonly have a little arc across those to say this is a phrase. Just as we denote bar lines, we also have a phrase. So this is our way of saying, hey, this is the broader, bigger phrase, which is this section, where it goes like this. We've got the same with our organ line. So we do the same thing. Now this is much easier to make sense of because now we've got some order here. We can see that this section has a grace note, as in it comes before. It's there before, so it's easy to see, whereas if it's just some little block sitting here amongst millions of random blocks like this, it is so much harder to see. So, order in this way. Consolidate your phrases, put them together. That way you don't need to create extra clutter of blocks. Similarly, if you've decided, look, I don't want the guitar to play in this section, doing this is a bad plan. While it's useful when you're testing to see whether we want the guitar to play at this point, it's not useful when we come back and find these things we haven't made a decision on. If it's playing or it's not playing. If we decide it's not playing, simply take it away. Gone. Now it's super easy to read this. I would even get rid of the automation that's part of this as well, because it's not necessary. It serves no purpose, so be super tidy, consolidate your phrases, make it very easy to read your arrangement view, because that's literally what this is, the arrangement of things, and by being able to see what's going on, it's very good. Now the other issue that I see is that people are working in like this. And yes, you can say, but Benedict, that's the work locally. But you've forgotten the second part, which is think globally. So Z for zoom out. Now I can see my whole workspace. I often keep my end marker fairly close to where I'm working, meaning that my zoom down the bottom is quite consistent. Up to you how you manage that. Different DAWs behave a little differently. Some don't even have end markers. Fair enough. So the thing here is that I'm looking at the whole picture. As my piece gets bigger, I will simply have more stuff going on. So say, hypothetically, I decide that I want more stuff. I've decided, okay, I'm going to copy this bit out, but I don't want that extra little grace note. I'm just guessing for the moment. And I don't want this playing, and this doesn't have a purpose, so in which case I'm just going to slice him there and get rid of him. Then see how I now zoom, and now I've got a bigger sense of what's happening. Really, really important. So zoom out. So when you're on this screen, you are working globally. If I go and say, look, I want to change something in this guitar line, now I'm zoomed in. I'm working in this little section. I can press whatever I press to focus and loop this. But I don't always work in such a tight loop, or I will be very careful to zoom out and go, how is this flowing? If I've made this change, like this change here, does this flow? Otherwise, you can be working so zoomed in that you think that what you're doing right here is excellent, but it makes no sense in the bigger picture. So, zoom out. Rather than going, I'm going to work here, because that gives me more detail, you can do that whilst you're working here at the note level, but in your arrangement you want to be zoomed as far out as you can so you can see the big picture, and then you can say, look, I want to alter this little bit here. If you have to zoom in to alter that bit there, fine, but chances are you don't need to. Now we really need to make space for creativity. We've prepared the ground, we've cleared away a lot of clutter, which is making space for creativity. Now we really need to add more space. Common things that I see is people set up loops. So as I've got a loop here, this just keeps going around. And so they just listen to this little bit over and over and over and over and over, which means it starts to become boring. They start to become dissatisfied, and they think they've got to work it harder to make it stay interesting. Probably not. Okay, if your piece is poor in the first place, yes. But assuming that you wrote something that you were like, hey, this is worth developing, then you need to move forward. As long as you've got this set to loop, 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 then you're not moving forward. You're staying exactly in the same spot. You have become a stick in the mud. So turn off loops. It's not uncommon whilst I'm working, even though focused here, I will want to hear the transition. So I will want to hear the changes that I've made for my new part that goes, does that fit with what came before? Does that fit with what's coming after? Assuming I already know what's coming after. If it doesn't, then it doesn't matter how amazing this is. My name's Jordan Emerson. If it doesn't fit, it's irrelevant and it should go whoop at the back door. So make sure you've turned off loops. And the same is turn off drum patterns. I see a lot of people who've just dropped in a drum pattern. Oh, well, that's a cool drum pattern. That's a good loop. And they drop it in and it just plays forever. Forever and ever and ever. So even past where their music has finished, they've either dropped in their drum pattern, like they've gone, I'll do this so that I can keep playing and the drum will always be there. The problem with that is that there's no room for movement. They've said this is my loop and this is going to be my loop ad nauseum. This is not how it works. So turn these things off. You might say, oh, but I need that to work with, otherwise I won't know what I'm doing. No, you're going the wrong way. It relates to the next thing. The question always has to be, what comes next? So if I've got this loop, let's just kill these. If I've got this loop, there's no cause to be asking what comes next because it's already there, it's already done. And therefore you've snookered yourself. There's no room for the brain to say what comes next. Okay, now it's hung, so I'm going, well, what comes next? That might come next. The more you allow yourself to, you'll start to hear things that come next. And then you work out how to put them in, and you work out how to make them fit. Sometimes what you put in is great, but it needs a bar or two to transition from here to there, a little break. Or it's great, but the two don't butt together, so you've got to put another piece, another section in the middle. But the big trick is to turn off the loop so that you can allow the brain to say, this is what I'm hearing next. Because if you're only and automatically hearing this happen again, that's all you can do. You find yourself stuck putting more and more layers on your loop and never moving forward. So it's really important. Creativity comes where there is a set of limits and you've got to work out what to do within that. So I've got my graveyard scene, I've got a sense of what my instruments are. Sometimes I might say I'm only going to have these instruments. But invariably, most of the time when I'm working, I'm going, well, what do I hear next? Is that like an oboe line? Is that like a clarinet line? Is it like a string? Is it like a saxophone? Is it what do I hear coming next? And you move forward, because the moment you loop, you find that you just, as I said, pile up things. You create a loop where you dead end yourself, and then you abandon it, commonly with either Document 3 or Attack of the Killer Turtles, because maybe that's going to seem clever. And then you've got a drive full of loops which go nowhere because you've always got the loop on. And when you open them going, I thought I had a real cool thing here, it opens with the loop and you just hear the loop go round and round, and it's not long before you go, there's nothing I can do with this. I'm hopeless. I'm useless. Turn off drum patterns. Turn off loops. You'll see where I've got drums here. They were actually they were the third thing composed. I started with this guitar. Let's just bring our mixer in just for the ability to mute things. So I started with this guitar. I actually started here. And I thought, yeah, but I want to make a variation of that somehow is a little cooler. So I front-loaded the movement. And then, of course, I can put the two together because they're variations. So we hear that sort of change itself around. I thought, well, okay, next I'm going to want a bass. So I put in a bass. I didn't think too much about my first putting the bass line in. I went pretty predictable. But then with the second one, I said, no, I'm now going to write something that's interesting and moves and grooves, so it makes my piece unique rather than just going boom, 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 boom like a lazy turd. Now that's interesting. And then, once I had that and sort of felt like, yeah, this moves nicely, I went and did drums. And you'll see that drums actually start with this pattern, but this pattern is built around what I've got. And as we move to the second section, even more so. So I started with something pretty predictable. It's a drummer who's marking time and doesn't really have anything to work with. Now the whole band opens up and starts to get all Thelonious Monk on us. So now I've got something that's really happening. So that's it. Again, tips for being organized to help your creativity, not hinder it. Always work locally, but think globally. Or think globally, and then just do your work locally. Make sure you prepare the ground. So as soon as you can, set up the scene in which you're working. For me, that's the reverb. I find I compose much better when I've got a reverb to work into because I'm always thinking, okay, that's where I'm going. If I decide to change my mind and go, no, this isn't about goths and graveyards, this is about tic-tacs with legs, then I'm going to change that space. Naming, as soon as I've got some sense of what this might be, then I will give it a name. I've been doing it long enough to be able to get away with calling things document, but I'm uncomfortable with that until I give them a name. I work in a tidy workspace. I have 3 screens, so I don't have to do what I'm showing here, but if I am stuck with one screen, then I will work with my arrangement here, Z to zoom, so that I'm on the out. When I'm working on something specific, then I'm zooming into here. If I come into this window and it's like this, then unless I want to see all of this, then I'll press Z. If I want to be aware of what's going on both sides, I'll then just move it so that I can see, well, this is what's happening coming in, this is what's happening going out. So I've got my starting point and my target point, important parts of composition. Otherwise, you write something that works on its own, loops, but wild, and you can't match it to the next bit. I consolidate my phrases. So rather than this being that whole pile of meaningless blocks, they are all joined together into phrases and sections. So yes, each of these phrases is 2-bar long, but rather than keeping the 2-bar phrases, once I realize these are the section, the bigger phrase, then I turn them into that. So it makes it much easier to say this is the area that I'm working. This all belongs together rather than a plethora of random pointless blocks. Again, if I decide that I don't want this, I don't mute it. I delete it. So it's then a clear, empty, open space inside my arrangement, which gives me freedom to say, do I want something else in its place, or is this a rest space for that instrument? And I make sure that my loops, as soon as possible, are turned off. And even if I'm working on this area here, I want to see what the transition is. There's no point making the perfectest loop that has no ability to transition to the piece. Sometimes that happens, in which case I've got to work out how to transition. Either that's changing the contents of that loop, moving the instruments a little bit so that they merge, or, as I said, creating a couple of bars transition, boom, 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 to make some sense of how we went from to boom, 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 because otherwise boom, 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 there's no connection, whereas boom, 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 boom makes sense. You've got to work that out, but by having your loops off and also getting rid of drum patterns that just go all the time. I know quite a few people that in EDM, they start with a 4 on the floor, and the 4 on the floor is sketched out already, so it's always there. They're never without their 4 on the floor. Yeah, but what if you could do something that was so much more interesting with a different rhythmic pattern? That way you can come up with something that's cool, that isn't exactly the same as everyone else's 4 on the floor piece. Always be able to ask yourself, what comes next? So again, I could open up a thing and go, so okay, I now have something that I can build on. And that makes me think of what comes next. Maybe it's this. And see how I don't play the one thing, I play the two things. Yay! And it's also possible that we may have some advantage in doing something like this. and I'm actually hearing something a little different here. And I think it's going to be that. Tidy that up. Cool. Got a nice droopy goth sort of a feel. Now those two clearly belong together, so I'm going to join them together. And I know that most of my things are 8 bars, so I can actually stretch that out to 8 bars and know that I got to keep working on it. That's what comes next. By allowing ourselves to move forward, stepping outside of the loop, which causes us to abandon things, I've now got, okay, that's all cool, and that's something new for me to work up, to say, okay, now I'm going to put all the parts around that, and how does that work? And as much as possible, I'm going to not be lazy. It's easy to say, oh, well, I'll just carry these drums over. For a reason they're not playing. Ah, yes, because too many solos. Yeah, how that's not really very thoughtful. That's actually okay, but the reality is a great drummer is probably not going to play exactly the same pattern there unless it's deliberate. I could use that first pattern because it does match, the second pattern doesn't. But once I've set this up and got the music going, then I may find that a slightly different pattern works even better because it emphasizes, accentuates the rhythm that I've got going here. And it's by having this silence at the end that I fall into that I'm able to say what comes next, and then I can move around my project really easily because I can clearly see what is what. I'm not having to mess around going, oh, well, I don't know what that is, or that's confusing, or look at all the flashing lights, I must be a producer. No, it's all nice and clean and tidy. Plus, of course, if I'm saying, look, I want to get rid of the drums and the bass, then obviously I can go to my rhythm bus. So it's all nice and tidy and organized. Now again, I would not be working this way because I have 3 screens, and I strongly recommend that. I don't recommend working one screen. Get 2 or 3 monitors. It makes a massive difference in your ability to manage what's going on. All right, if you have questions about the method, ask them down below. Of course, if you're interested in working with somebody to help you do this, then also down below. Most importantly, get out there. You have a great day.